Hey folks, Creasy here. This is a response to a video I saw recently by a YouTuber called the Distributist. In the video he explains the reasons for his conversion from a new atheist to a Roman Catholic. Now, even though I disagree with this guy, I have to say that this is one of the best videos I've seen in a long time. The guy clearly explains his rationale in a thought-provoking and provocative way. It's an hour-long video, but I really recommend that you go check it out. The link is in the low bar. This guy has definitely earned a new subscriber from me, and I'll be binge watching his other video content soon, but as of this point, I've only seen this video. So forgive me if I bring up anything that he has previously addressed. Anyway, let's do this.
I was very ready to believe that science was the only form of knowledge, and that technology was the only mechanism for human development. After all, the non-scientific and non-mathematical truths I was taught in school seemed so paltry. Non-science was uncertain, and science was confident. Non-science was subjective, and science was objective. And most damning of all, non-science constantly second-guessed itself and never had consistent answers, while science seemed to almost never be wrong. Indeed, it was this confidence that science provided that I found most comforting of all about the subject, in contrast to the other forms of knowledge and human understanding I was presented in my education. I liked science because it was so infrequently wrong.
So a summary of the Distributist's arguments is that he and many other people like him became atheists because science can attempt to answer certain types of difficult questions and does so more confidently than other types of thought such as religion, philosophy, alchemy, etc. This confidence attracts followers to science, or I suppose believers in science, who treat it like a religion. He claims that there are some questions that science can't answer, and here are some examples that he gives. The questions in the outer left and lighter colour are the ones that he claims science can't address. Now, I can quibble with him on these scientific questions. In fact, science either can or potentially can in the future answer most of the ones that he's marked unanswerable. For example, evolutionary biology can already provide answers to the question, what is beauty? And even one possible scientific answer for the question, what is right and wrong? Though these need not necessarily be the only answers to these questions, or even the only scientific answers to these questions, but the specifics are besides the point. Now, I could also argue that while it's true that humans may never have the capability to answer all of the big questions scientifically, this does not preclude there being a hypothetical scientific answer that may simply be beyond human capability at any point in our future history. But I'm not going to do this either. No. That would all be missing the forest for the trees. So instead what I'm going to do is burn the forest down.
That bandit in the forest in Burma. Did you catch him?
Yes,
How?
we burned the forest down.
You may have heard this one before, but there's a famous 17th century thought experiment by a guy called Descartes, which he labelled the evil demon. And there's also a variation from the 1960s that I'm going to talk about called brain-in-a-vat. Now, you guys have all seen The Matrix, right? So imagine that there's an evil scientist that's artificially grown your brain in a vat. You have no way of knowing this. The brain's kept alive on life support systems and tubes, and it's hooked up to a computer that feeds it sensory information from a simulation. So everything that you see, hear, feel, taste, and touch is fed to you by a computer and is not real. The question is, in the absence of Morpheus and a red pill, how would you ever know that you're in a simulation? It's impossible. Nothing in your experience would lead you to that conclusion. Now, what if the evil scientist was fucking with you, and in the world you've always known, and that he has complete control over, he swapped it around so that black is actually white, dogs act like cats, and chocolate tastes like bacon? These changes would all seem completely normal and natural to you, since this is the only experience that you've ever had of the world around you. Dogs have always been cats, and chocolate with eggs makes for a nutritious breakfast.
Thus, as the mind conforms to reality on the diagonals of the matrix, we have correct beliefs. But more interesting still is when we examine the interplay between belief and reality across the alternative diagonal. Here, we see errors when the mind does not conform to the universe. When the human mind perceives a statement to be true that is not true about the universe, it falls in the upper right-hand corner and creates a false positive belief. Scientists label this kind of error a type 1 error. Conversely, when the human mind perceives a statement to be false, which is in fact true, it falls on the lower left corner, creating a false negative belief. Scientists oftentimes call this error a type 2 error. And thus, this 2x2 matrix completely describes the truth or falsehood of human belief.
Okay, so with our brain in the vat, what if the evil scientist really started fucking with us? And he tuned it up so that 100% of everything that we perceive is false. So 100% of human knowledge is in fact a type 1 error. And 100% of what we think is untrue is a type 2 error. In this scenario, everything that human beings believe confidently to be true is actually wrong. This is completely possible, and if it is true, we would have no way of knowing it. As you demonstrate in your video, all science is just human observation of facts. It is not actually the facts, and potentially all of it may be wrong. So, now that our forest of confidence is a charred, smouldering wreck, let's ask ourselves a question. Does discrediting science in any way prove or disprove God? Does it change the likelihood of God's existence or the rationale for believing in him? Obviously, the answer is no. We should not be conflating science with atheism. They are not the same thing. A person can be an atheist and fully admit that there is a theoretical possibility that all of science is bunk. Now, I'm not saying that it is, I'm just saying that it's theoretically possible. Yes, there are many people that for psychological reasons virtue signal their belief in team science. Many people in fact do structure their beliefs around science, and this requires them to believe that human perception is necessarily correct perception. And we have no way of knowing that this is true, but that doesn't prove God. We need to separate the question, is science true, from the question, is God true? These claims are not in opposition to one another, and any combination of answers is possible. Feel free to hold your beliefs if they benefit you, but don't think that false confidence in science is any kind of flaw with atheism. Atheism is not science.
As viewers of my channel know, I'm a former New Atheist myself, having at one time found thinkers like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Penn Jillette to be very compelling. I subsequently left this perspective on the universe behind, before eventually coming back to religion, and more specifically Roman Catholicism.
What I do find strange is the adoption in your case of something so specific as Roman Catholicism. I'm wondering if this is just post hoc rationalization, because following your line of reasoning, it seems far more logical that you would arrive at something like deism as opposed to some more prescriptive belief structure. You can have your God of the gaps, and we can argue about where the gaps are, but by arguing the Roman Catholic God, you are claiming that you have faith that this specific God is true, and not some other conception of God. How can you possibly know this? Or even have faith that it's true? Why the Roman Catholics and not the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Shintos, or the branched Davidians, for God's sake? Why not Scientology? The primary difference between that and the Roman Catholics is a perceived authority of 2,000 years. That's really all that it is. Well, that and alleged comments from L. Ron Hubbard about tax avoidance schemes, but let's not go there.
As mentioned before, human beings hate uncertainty and lack of confidence. In previous ages, the knowledge presented by authorities, be they philosophers, artists, priests, or studiers of the physical universe, would have all been perceived as being high confidence, of being something that could be relied upon. However, after the scientific revolution, the relative lack of confidence of non-scientific fields of endeavor was immediately recognized, by contrast to the high amounts of confidence generated by scientific findings themselves. Indeed, this did not make the other ways of knowing less confident or less reliable than they were before, but through means of contrast, this created a distinct cognitive dissonance among the collective minds of humanity.
It's true that old ways of knowing are not less reliable than before the advent of the scientific method, but that does not demonstrate that they were ever in any way reliable to begin with. Now, there are obviously examples where we know that non-scientific approaches have resulted in demonstrable benefits to people. Obvious examples are meditation or acupuncture, and we may not necessarily know scientifically exactly why all of these things help us. It is also possible that there are truths in the old ways that are obscured from us currently because of the approach and the rigidity of the scientific method, or even because scientific discoveries on which our truths are based may turn out to be false. Science can be both useful and misleading, but the same applies to proto-science, and the rates at which each is useful or misleading are not the same. I think we can all agree that, pragmatically speaking, science is useful at a far greater percentage of the time than proto-science. But to take your point, while I believe that science can indeed provide answers to many, though not all, of your big questions, it does not do so in a way that is psychologically satisfying to human beings, or at least not always. Speaking of which, when looking at proto-science, we also can't discount the placebo effect, where a person receives tangible benefits from nothing more than a psychological belief that something false is actually true. Sugar pills can work miracles, and there's nothing wrong with deriving psychological benefit regardless of where it came from. It's perfectly rational. But by converting from atheism to Roman Catholicism, it seems to me that what you are doing is intentionally dosing yourself with placebo. The problem is, at what point does the placebo wear off? When there are doubts and crises of faith, does this discomfort and uncertainty not undermine the very reason that you hold faith to begin with? What interests me is that you follow a religion knowing that the need for religion is primarily psychological. We feel comfort in having answers to the big questions, but the problem with that is, our answers may be wrong. And if we hold to a proto-science approach, we will in fact never know the answers. Now, because of Descartes, we will never be sure that the scientific method can give us the answers either. But by accepting the pre-existing mythology, you're giving up the search for rational truth in exchange for a fleeting and unstable psychological comfort. The fact that you've correctly identified that scientific materialists also do the same thing sometimes does not mean that you yourself are on the right path. Now, Ben Franklin once said something along the lines of, "He who chooses safety over liberty deserves neither." Well, I say, he who chooses psychological comfort over truth takes the same risk. Well, that's what I have to say. Thanks for listening if you've gotten this far. Please leave a comment in the comments section. Chrissy out.